Welcome to the 2020 Vision Bible Study, where we will focus on 5 of life's great purposes. Our focus today is on God's people. Today we're going to be focusing on God's people. And we're going to be looking at God's people in the context of the local church. So let's go ahead and dive into it. Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. And this is what it says. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and signs were being performed through the apostles. Now all the believers were together and held all things in common. They sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all as they had any need. Every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple and broke bread from house to house. They ate their food with joyful and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. Every day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. Acts chapter 2 is a wonderful, wonderful picture of the local church. But we need to understand that this picture of the early church right here in Acts chapter 2 is really a church in the honeymoon phase. It's the church in its infancy. Now, it's an immature church that is hungry and they just are ready to grow. What do I mean by they were an immature church? Well, think about this for a second. The church has just exploded. Only about 120 of the over 3,000 members of the church have been Christians for any length of time whatsoever. So they really are young Christians as far as they haven't been Christians for very long. So they need a lot of teaching, a lot of instruction. They have a lot of maturing to do. So this model isn't a model that, hey, the church today needs to go back to meeting every single day and the church members need to start selling all their possessions. That's not what we're going to focus on here. But we really kind of need to understand that while it was in its infancy, while they did these wonderful things that really helped the church grow and launch, they kind of did settle in. And as they settled, the 4 activities that we just read about in verse 42 continue all throughout the New Testament. And if you're involved in a local church, you should see these 4 activities still continue today. The first activity that God's people did was they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. Now today, we listen to our wonderful pastors, staff, and other gifted teachers in the church as they lead us, as they instruct us. And we get to, as a body of believers, listen to wonderful teaching that together we can discuss, that we can talk about. In small groups, we have small group leaders that teach us, that guide discussions, that help us grow. The reason why we sit under teaching, solid biblical teaching, is so that we can obtain more knowledge about God. And the purpose of obtaining knowledge about God is so that we can be transformed to be in the image of God, so that we can be more like Jesus. Knowledge for the sake of knowing facts. Anybody can do that, but God's people, we understand that God's word has the ability to transform, to change us, to mold us to be more like Jesus. The second activity was fellowship. Now, I'm Baptist, and as Baptists, we love meet and greets. Potluck is, oh man, it is game on at most Baptist churches. We love to sit down and have a meal together. A lot of Baptist churches have a specific building or a big, huge room that we call the fellowship hall. Now, the thing about this is eating, while it can be a part of fellowship, that's not what biblical fellowship was about. Biblical fellowship goes much deeper than just sharing a meal together. Biblical fellowship is sharing life together. The word that we get fellowship from is koinonia. Now, that word means common. So God's people held all things in common. Unity is a strong emphasis of fellowship. Now, when we look at how the early church sold their possessions, they laid them down, the money down at the apostles' feet, they distributed it upon those that had need. We see that this isn't community ownership, this is community equality. They saw each other as equals. And the reason they did so is that they understood two important things. First was their great need for God. They understood that without Jesus stepping down from heaven and providing himself as our sacrifice, that we have no hope for salvation. So they were unified around their great need for God. Also, they had a great need for one another, and they understood that. They realized what 1 Corinthians chapter 12 teaches us, that although there were many people, together they could be unified as one body, having Christ as their head. So they needed God and they needed one another. The third activity was they broke bread. Now, I just said fellowship wasn't just about breaking bread, but here we see that breaking bread and sharing a meal was part of the activity that the church did. Now, when they broke bread, one, it was a common meal. They did often share a meal together. They would meet in homes and they would enjoy a meal together, which for some of them, it was probably a great thing because not everyone had enough to eat. So again, fellowship, sharing, community, seeing each other as equals. The second way they broke bread was by having communion. It reminds us that when Jesus said, hey, as often as you do this in remembrance of me, to break bread, to drink the wine, and to have communion together. That way it reminds God's people the reason they gathered together is because of the great sacrifice that Jesus made. So they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, they broke bread together, and fourth was prayer. Prayer is this awesome, wonderful, beautiful gift that God has given us to communicate with him. Now, prayer, we can let our requests be known, we can listen to God, and through prayer, God changes us to give us a heart that leans not for us and our desires, but it starts to lean for God and his desires. Now, as they did these four activities together, something remarkable happened. First, they were blessed. It says that they were filled with joy when they met together. Second, God was glorified. When they met together, not only were they filled with joy, but they began to give their praise to God, expressing gratitude, adoration for God. And third, the lost were saved. Now, isn't this a beautiful picture of what God's people are supposed to be like when they're together? Unified together in love for God, love for one another. So here's my challenge for you. My challenge is first, if you are not in a local church, get plugged in, get involved in a local church. Get involved not only in a local church, but make sure you're also involved in a small group. One of the things that we just read was they met together in the temple, which was a large group, but they also met house to house in small groups. So make sure you are part of a small group. And lastly is be the type of Christian that is showing love for one another. As you love God, love one another, serve each other well, and do so with unity. And if we love God's people like that, then you will be filled with joy. God will be glorified, and the lost will be saved.